Hello, and welcome to A Reader's History of Science Fiction. I'm Alex Howe, and this is Season 2, Episode 16. Catch-up Episode Number 6, Children's Sci-Fi Movies. There were a surprisingly large number of these in the pandemic era. When it came to books, I discussed in Season 1 how I found children's sci-fi to be rather sparse, but that's not quite true in recent years. In the 21st century, children's sci-fi in books has expanded, and movies have done the same. In fact, I didn't even watch all of the ones worth mentioning myself, but I think I got a good overview. Now, on balance, a lot of these movies were only so-so. Many of them got mixed reviews, especially between the critics and the audience. Space Jam 2 was the most divisive movie on the list, with Rotten Tomatoes giving it a critic score of 26 and an audience score of 79, but at least a couple of them were rated universally well. So let's start by getting out of the way the movies I didn't watch. I did not watch Artemis Fowl. Do you even remember that one? Because it had some of the worst reviews I've ever seen. And I did not watch Minions 2 because we can do better than that. And I also only watched the first Sonic the Hedgehog movie because of time constraints and because it felt like a pretty self-contained story anyway. On that note, Sonic the Hedgehog. This was the first film on my list, going back to early 2020. Now, this is a bit of an edge case. It's a video game film for starters. And is Sonic sci-fi or fantasy? I never played the games or read the comics or anything, but as portrayed in the movie, I'm thinking sci-fi. Sonic travels to other planets, not worlds. He has superpowers, not magic. The rings are used by advanced civilizations, not wizards. Incidentally, does he have a limited number of those rings, or are they reusable? He sure seemed to use a lot of them when he was fighting Dr. Robotnik. Also, I should ask, is Sonic the Hedgehog a kids' movie? There wasn't anything to preclude it from being so, but Wikipedia lists it as an action-adventure comedy, rather than a children's film. But Sonic is enough of a children's franchise that I'm going with yes. Anyway, Sonic, as you probably know, is a talking blue animal who claims to be a hedgehog, but doesn't really look like a hedgehog, and who can run at a non-negligible fraction of the speed of light. Seriously, when he runs to the Pacific and back, his kinetic energy should be measured in kilotons. Sonic grew up on a planet on the far side of the universe where he was raised by a talking owl named Longclaw, because of course. However, he is constantly in danger of people trying to capture him for his power, so he lives in secret and flees to a new planet using the warp rings from the video game whenever he's found out. 10 years later, Sonic is living on Earth in a small town in Montana. One day, he accidentally causes a power outage large enough to attract the attention of the US government, and he is prevented from leaving Earth by an ill-timed intervention by the local sheriff. The government, quite sensibly, sends the military to investigate a possible terror attack, but quite unsensibly sends the mad scientist Dr. Robotnik to lead the team. Robotnik immediately tries to capture Sonic to further his plans of world domination, and wacky hijinks ensue. So, like I said, the first Sonic movie actually felt like a self-contained story, and pulled it off fairly well. I didn't see any large mistakes in the writing. But I think it's interesting in that respect, because a lot of aspects of the gameplay of the series, Tails and Knuckles, the Chaos Emeralds, Supersonic, and so forth, don't appear until the sequel. Now, maybe that would have made the first movie too complicated, but they certainly showed a lot of confidence in getting a sequel, and to be fair to the studio, the movie turned out pretty well, so it all worked out. The next movie on my list was Over the Moon, although this one is much more science fantasy. In fact, I thought there was a strong case for an it-was-all-a-dream explanation that would make it pure fantasy. This story is set in China, and in fact was made in partnership with the Shanghai-based Pearl Studio Company. It's about a 13-year-old girl named Fei Fei, who lost her mother several years ago, and is disillusioned with her father's desire to remarry. Fei Fei seeks to help her father restore the faith her parents shared in Chang'e, the Chinese moon goddess who is still followed today in Chinese folk religion. And to do this, she decides to build a rocket to go to the moon so she can prove that Chang'e is real. Fei Fei builds her rocket with a surprising level of technical skill, real physics aside, And it actually seems to work. Until her new stepbrother stows away, causing her weight calculations to be off. Luckily, they're rescued by Chang'e herself and taken to her lunar palace, but they soon learn that she is not kind and generous like the stories say. Ultimately, in the course of the story, Fei Fei and Chang'e must both come to terms with the losses of their pasts and move on. This movie honestly went a little too fantastical for my tastes. Overall, it was well done, but there's this weird mishmash, with Fei Fei thinking she even can get to the moon with real science, and seemingly succeeding, contrasted with the psychedelic magical realm of the Lunarian city, and it just came off as a little too weird to me. But maybe you'll like it better. It did tell the story well. Also, for the record, I didn't realize until I read the Wikipedia page that Gobi was supposed to be a pangolin. I'm not sure what they were thinking with his design. 2021 brought us another sort of sci-fi light film in Flora and Ulysses. This movie is based on the Newbery-winning novel by Kate DiCamillo, who also wrote Because of Winn-Dixie and The Tale of Despereaux. And this one is also a borderline case. It's a superhero story rather than hard sci-fi, and the actual superhero part is pretty minor in terms of the plot. Flora is a little girl and self-described cynic who is struggling with her parents' separation and her father's inability to get his comic books published. Ulysses is a squirrel whom she rescues after he gets sucked into a robotic vacuum cleaner. And despite her cynical worldview, she gets the idea that the traumatic experience could be a superhero origin story, and she turns out to be right. Ulysses develops flight, super strength, and the ability to understand English. In fact, the ability to read and write in English without being taught. But the story isn't really about that. The story is mainly about Flora's family reconciling with one another, and also them trying to save Ulysses from a slightly unhinged animal control officer who's a little too obsessed with rabies. Incidentally, there is such a thing as quarantine for rabies. They don't have to jump to brain sample, although I'm not sure what the rules would be for a squirrel. But that could just be the animal control guy's nuttiness, pun intended. However, the movie did make one fairly significant error. It's set in America, Vancouver in the book, ambiguous in the movie, but Ulysses is clearly a European squirrel. Well, clearly if you have an uncommonly large amount of knowledge about squirrels. Long story. I researched them for a book that I may still write at some point. Anyway, I'm not a huge fan of DiCamillo, and if you go into Flora and Ulysses looking for a superhero story, you may be disappointed. It's much more of a family story with a pet squirrel involved. On the other hand, there were two other movies from 2021 that I thought went in a very interesting direction. Space Jam: A New Legacy and The Mitchells vs. the Machines. And these two movies go together in my mind not because of any direct connection, but because they're both about the dangers of artificial intelligence. And sure, the idea of machines taking over the world goes back to The Matrix and The Terminator and beyond, but it has a different feel to it in 2021, and even more so in 2022 and 23, as real-life artificial intelligence becomes a big deal, as well as in the midst of our crazy social media environment. One thing I've been trying to do in these catch-up episodes is to look beyond the individual reviews and try to see what these new movies say about where science fiction is going as a genre. And AI is something that's becoming a big deal. You also see it in Ernest Cline's Ready Player 2. You sort of see it in Hank Green's A Beautifully Foolish Endeavor. This is some real sci-fi stuff that is coming to fruition today. Granted, AI isn't smart enough to take over the world, yet, but ChatGPT is smart enough to do a convincing impression of a person who wants to take over the world, if its programmers let it. And that's already some reason for worry. If we can work through some of these issues in sci-fi before they happen, so much the better. I actually tried prompting ChatGPT with Pinky and the Brain quotes as an example, but the site kept glitching out on me. It also glitched out for other random prompts, so I don't think it was because of the subject matter. Anyway, Space Jam: A New Legacy is the sequel to the hit 1996 sports movie Space Jam, starring the Looney Tunes and the then greatest basketball player in the NBA, Michael Jordan. In the original movie, the Toons are captured by space aliens to work in their amusement park, and they challenge the aliens to a game of basketball for their freedom. But they have to recruit Michael Jordan to help them after the aliens prove more competent than they expected. Space Jam: A New Legacy features the greatest NBA player of 2021, LeBron James. But there are no aliens involved in this one, and the Toons are not real beings living somewhere out there in Toon World. They're digital constructs in the Warner Brothers servers. In fact, the original Space Jam is never directly referenced at all in this movie. I don't know if that was for legal reasons or just because of the lack of continuity in cartoons. Regardless, this epic sports match is instigated when LeBron James, not the Toons, is captured and digitized by an evil computer program named Algorithm to boost his social media influence. And LeBron is forced to play a video game-style basketball game for his freedom with the Toons as his team. The twist, however, is that LeBron learns that the game was created by his son, who isn't interested in basketball and wants to be a game developer, which also makes it a tense father versus son contest where they have to reconcile to get out of it alive. For clarity, it was not LeBron's actual family in the film, or even their real names in fact, which is understandable but still seems a little bit weird. Also, there's a lot of social commentary to be had about how Algie entices people to his side with the promise of social media influence that I don't have time to get into here. This movie was not well received by the critics, but as I said earlier, the audience seemed to like it. And yeah, I thought it was decent. Maybe not as good as the original, but certainly not bad. However, the next movie on my list I thought was considerably better. This is actually one that I hadn't heard about until I stumbled on it over the holidays, but when I went back to make sure I had a more or less complete list, it was there. This is The Mitchells vs. the Machines. This movie was made by Sony, but was mostly a Netflix release after Sony handed it off from its theatrical schedule during the pandemic, which is probably why I missed it the first time around. The Mitchells vs. the Machines features a Mark Zuckerberg parody, who's actually named Mark, who creates an evil AI named Pal. Pal started as Mark's non-evil digital personal assistant on his phone, but when she became obsolete, replaced by his new Pal Max robots, he tossed her aside. In revenge, Pal takes over all the robots and rounds up all the humans to launch them into space so she can create a machine utopia on Earth. She does this partly with an iRobot-style robot army, but she lures many humans into her trap by somehow turning off the Wi-Fi worldwide and then promising free Wi-Fi, which is both a scathing commentary on our internet culture and should also give you an idea of the level of silliness we're dealing with here. Through a series of accidents, the Mitchell family are the only humans left free outside of Pal's influence. The Mitchells are an extremely dysfunctional family. Katie Mitchell is an aspiring filmmaker who is just going off to college. She was going to fly, but her father insisted on driving her across the country as family bonding time, which largely backfires until the robot apocalypse starts. Her father is a technophobe with a level of incompetence around computers normally associated with grandparents, and the whole family is pretty bad at getting along and working together in general. But when the Mitchells find themselves as the last humans on the outside, and also recruit 2 malfunctioning robots who have the kill code to shut down PAL, they take it upon themselves to come together as a family, drive to Silicon Valley, and save the world. They succeed, but it's largely by accident. Oh, and they also have to fight a giant Furby, which is just as creepy and hilarious as it sounds. This movie was a lot of fun. It's very funny, it has a lot of lessons about being a family, and it also has a lot of commentary about the tech industry. Just for a sample, consider when PAL's creator Mark says, "It's almost like stealing people's data and giving it to a hyper-intelligent AI as part of an unregulated tech monopoly was a bad thing." And in my opinion, it only gets better from there. In 2022, we returned to 2 movies from the 800-pound gorilla of the industry, Pixar's Lightyear and Disney Animation's Strange World. Strange World I reviewed on my blog, so you can read about it in more detail there. This was not a tech or video game kind of movie. It was more a turn back to the old-school pulp-era stories, except deconstructed for modern times. It's about a family of explorers who modernized their nation practically overnight with a plant that generates electricity. But now, something is killing the plant deep underground, and they have to journey down there to try to save it. And if you've been paying attention, Strange World did not do very well. I don't think it deserved as much flack as it got. It had some great visuals and fun speculative biology, which honestly carried quite a bit of weight for me. But it also had lackluster writing, clumsy messaging on the environmental side, and the plot was kind of weak in general. Still, I didn't think it was all that bad. Although, because it's more of an old-timey pulp story, which is fine by the way, it's not exactly as relevant to this episode. I'm more interested to talk about Lightyear, possibly because I ought to have reviewed it when it came out, but I didn't have time to see it until a month later. Lightyear is the cinematic debut of Buzz Lightyear, the toy from the original Toy Story. The premise here is that Lightyear was a movie that existed in the Toy Story universe in 1995, and it was Andy's favorite movie, which is why he got an all Buzz Lightyear-themed birthday party. This, simply put, did not work for me. As a standalone film, it was okay. Again, lackluster writing and kind of a weak storyline, but not bad by any means. But for what the filmmakers set out to do, I honestly think it failed pretty badly. And the biggest reason is that I just cannot see Lightyear being the favorite movie of a 7-year-old boy. There are differing opinions of Andy's age in the first film, but if you count backwards from Toy Story 3, you get 7. Lightyear doesn't make sense in this role because it deals with heavy themes of failure, regret, trauma, and mortality. Personally, I felt the entire first act, where Buzz keeps skipping through time until the people he's trying to help all die of old age, has layers of messed upness that I question the wisdom of putting in a kids' movie in the real world, let alone in the Toy Story world, if that makes sense. There are the usual jokes, of course, but I did not see a lighthearted romp that would appeal to 7-year-olds. And that's just on its own merits. Note that in the toy commercial in the original movie, Buzz was described as a superhero, which was a little odd even in context and definitely doesn't fit here. Caveat to this, I couldn't find much information about how actual 7-year-olds responded to the film. I found a few parents' reviews that said their kids liked it, but they also said it would probably go over the heads of younger kids, with which I agree. Then, there's the problem of how it fits into the franchise. The movie blatantly does not follow the original lore. Zurg is old Buzz and he wants to change the past? That doesn't match the Zurg toy claiming to be Buzz's father in Toy Story 2, something Lightyear itself pokes fun at. And it certainly doesn't match the Star Wars ripoff lines Buzz quotes in Toy Story 1. In fact, it's not even clear how they got to the point where they are in the epilogue with the Galactic Alliance. Did they manage to recreate the crystallic fusion drive after all? I feel like I missed something. However, Lightyear's director, Angus MacLane, has resolved some of this. In his mind, he says, Lightyear was not a new movie in 1995. Rather, it was a movie from the 80s or even the 70s that Andy saw on VHS, and which then got remade into a cartoon in the 90s. The same Buzz Lightyear of Star Command cartoon that aired on the real-life ABC in 2000, which was then the inspiration for the toys. And having watched it as a kid, I can confirm that the cartoon makes much more sense as an origin story for the toy Buzz. Although the two are so different from each other that it sounds more like a situation where an original script had a famous name slapped on it to make more money. Like the Will Smith iRobot, or Pirates of the Caribbean 4. I mean, I guess How to Train Your Dragon made changes that radical between the books and the movies, but you don't expect that kind of thing between movie and TV show. Of course, all this happened because Pixar, and John Lasseter in particular, apparently hated the cartoon and have forced Disney to disown it. Which is a shame because I think it's a lot better than Lightyear. But there's no way to get it today besides eBay and a sketchy-looking rip on YouTube that may or may not exist by the time you're listening to this episode. Anyway, links to all of this in the description. This has been A Reader's History of Science Fiction. This podcast is hosted by Libsyn and is available on all the major platforms. You can find me on YouTube at Science Meets Fiction, on Twitter and Mastodon at Sci Meets Fiction, and my website is sciencemeetsfiction.com. For my movie recommendation for this episode, I'll admit none of these movies really blew me away like, say, League of Super Pets did. But on this list, I think the best one is The Mitchells vs. the Machines, which really was very good, and by a happy coincidence, I think is also the most forward-looking of these movies, with its focus on AI and the future of tech. In the next episode, my friend Greg will be coming in to co-host again, and continuing on the tech theme, we will be talking about sci-fi in video games. Since I'm not a gamer, and he is, at least more than I am, I think he should have some good insights. Thanks for listening.